Hi there. I see some of you all out there, or I see your names or pictures anyway.
Hello.
Hey, Danielle, is that you?
Yes, it is.
Oh,
Hi.
good. There you are. Hey, you look just like that lady's picture.
Oh, good. Thank you.
Imagine
Mission
that.
accomplished.
You look just like her, right?
Yes, thank you. Mission accomplished.
Oh, good. Well, I'm so glad to see or get to meet some of you by Zoom. I don't see you in person, but I do get to meet you in Zoom. So I do like to see your faces when we're going through our sessions just to get acquainted with you. So you're
Gotcha.
brand new with us as well. Hey, there's Tammy. Her face came up. Hey, Tammy. I have a daughter named Tammy. So I really like that name. So look,
Hi.
you be careful out there in that car, okay? Oh, okay. You're oh, like that's good. She's not driving.
Oh,
It
okay.
always scares me when and every now and then that's the only way we can pick up a class is put it on and it's like, oh no, I get lost in trying to listen to something and I'm gonna run over somebody or get run over. Oh, great. Well, Lou, are you out there? I see that name. He's trying to connect now. Cool. Well, I just talked to somebody at the National Association of Realtors. I don't talk to them very often. And I thought I was getting ready to get on the class. And I went, oh no, look at that number that just popped up on my ID. And so I had called them yesterday for some help with an issue and they called me back. So I thought that was a pretty good way to start the call to let you know that National Association of Realtors really will call you back.
That's
So I
good.
thought that was pretty neat. That's more than some people do, you know. Yeah. So now you all know that when you joined Canopy, right? When you joined Canopy, there's Evelyn. Hey, girl. You actually joined the National Association of Realtors, the North Carolina Association of Realtors, and the local, which is Canopy Association. So that large fee that you paid actually was three fees.
Yeah.
And now in January, start saving now or ask Santa Claus to bring you some good money. Hi, you want to make sure that by January 1, we're going to have to pay all those dues all over again because they're annual fees. The association fees are annual. So once
Mhm.
you pay them before January 1, then you're good for the year. And I think when y'all join, you got a prorated amount, if I'm not mistaken. And which
Mhm.
helps I think everybody should join toward the end of the year. So that's a pretty good chunk of money, isn't it, when you join Canopy? But now have all of y'all finished your classes down at Canopy? You know, you have an orientation class and you have the actually hands-on training with the MLS. Have you done those already?
Yeah.
Yes.
Good. Go. Look at you all. And I bet you've just finished Ignite too, haven't you?
Yes.
Not
Have you
yet.
finished or you're in it?
I
Oh,
finished.
you're getting, oh, you finished, but you're getting ready to go in. Oh, Ignite's a good class. Well, I should say classes. We have had different patterns of teaching that information, but a lot of the information is something that Gary Keller and the whole organization of Keller Williams International they've rewritten that thing about four times, updating, but the basics are still the basics, and you still have to learn the basics and rely on the basics. In different markets, you might have to put more emphasis on one side of it or maybe another aspect of it. So right now have been in what we call a seller's market. Prices are high. Sellers can get just about whatever they want. It's been a very strange but interesting time. I've been in the business for about almost 40 years. And so I started in kindergarten. But anyway, I've been in business a long time. And I have never seen a market like we've just gone through. So I think you're blessed to be getting in it on this side rather than the last 2 years, quite honestly. But we've survived it. And now we're going into a more balanced market. You'll hear the word shift a lot. we've shifted from a very strong seller's market where the buyers just have to pay whatever the sellers want. I mean, the sellers really controlled. But now with the interest rates, the sellers are having to be more reasonable, and because the buyers can't buy, and the interest rates have gotten so high. So, and I say so high. When I first started in real estate, interest rates were 18 to 22%.
Wow.
Can you imagine paying 18% on a first mortgage? They were paying 18% on a first mortgage, and they could assume some of the government loans. And the second mortgage, after you assumed the first one at 18, you paid up to 22%. And yes, we sold houses back then too, so to have a 7 or 8%, it's like, well, we've been there before, but not quite in the same manner. So, but anyway, you're going to, you're in for a very interesting career. It really is a profession that you can be pleased to be a part of. And they're not what they call glass ceilings. It's really up to you. So many times I quote to myself, it's up to me if it's going to be. And that's really what you're in a career that you're going to have adversity, you're going to have factors, but you can make your business what you want to make it. But I'm not telling you it's easy. I'm not telling you it's going to be not without a lot of work, a lot of long hours. People get in the real estate business sometimes to think they can control their hours better, and they think they're going to have lots more free time. Don't kid yourself. Not right at first, you won't. So just treat yourself like your boss, and make yourself do the things you need to do and put this work toward it, and it will be rewarding. Like I say, after all these years, I'm not bored with it yet. There's a new wrinkle every day. There's something for you to learn. And we were talking about, I think last week, Evelyn, it's like nothing but overwhelmed right now. I'm sure it's like, oh my gosh, will I ever get all this stuff? And can't you simplify it somehow? I wish we could, but there's so many angles with everything we're trying to teach. But you all are here today, and we're going to be talking about working with North Carolina buyers and look at the forms. Your forms are your tools, and the more you can know about your tools, the better you can do your business, because otherwise you're going to be taking directions that you don't need to be taken. So if you'll learn your tools, and if I were you, I hope you'll be reading your contract once a month because you're writing one, but make sure you read these agency agreements and your contracts. It's not that you memorize them, but you got to digest them, or ingest them. You really want to get to know the provisions of these contracts, because that gives you an edge, because not everybody does it, but you're here to learn. And so let's see now if I can get some forms up. Okay, here we go. Let's see if I try not to lose you. I'm going to share, and I've got to go to this. I did find out one angle last week that I missed you on. Let's see. I want to do, I try to pull them up ahead of time, and sometimes when I pull them up ahead of time, they don't come up the way we need them. So we're going to do it this way today.
And where do you pull the blank forms from? Because I wanted to print some off and take notes.
Well, what we're going to do is after the class, I'm going to send you these forms. Your forms are going to be in a program called DocuSign. And you know what? Now I don't see you. This is the same problem we had last week, isn't it, Evelyn? We got the forms, but then we didn't get the, there you are. Y'all see me in the forms?
Yep, we do now.
Yes.
You can see the forms? Let's
Yes.
see if I'm going to make them a little bit larger so you can see a little bit. Is that a little bit better?
Yes.
Can you read on the screen now?
Yes.
Okay. Now I will send all these to you so you'll actually have it. So put your email address in the chat box for me. And then when I'm finished, then I'll email them over to you. But I'm just going to go through them. When you need to write an offer or have a consultation, you're going to go into your command program. And if you go to the Tuesday afternoon classes with Leah or Jules, you'll be able to get the patterns and the system of command. And in command, you set up what's called an opportunity. And then in that opportunities, where you're going to be entering the parties' names and the address and your basic, your what you would put on the outside of a file folder, really. And then when you get into setting up the transaction, that is where you'll be able to get to the blank forms. So, but we don't have another place for them. The forms come from the North Carolina Realtors Association. There are some forms from the state of North Carolina, but 95% of them come from the Realtor Association, and they copyright the forms. So there are only certain places that you actually can offer those forms, because basically it's where realtors can reach and can get into them. So that you will set your forms up in those opportunities, and opportunities are like I said, they're like a file folder, and all your information is going to be in there, and you're going to upload the forms as you use them into that opportunity. So that's an electronic file cabinet for you to keep all your information in. And by the way, we in North Carolina are required to keep any document that's signed by the sellers or the buyers, any client, any form that's part of the transaction. We are required to keep it for 3 years. And if you get your South Carolina license, you're going to be required to keep it for 5 years. And IRS says to keep it for 7 years. So needless to say, I've got files 20 years old in my garage because, unless you call them every year, you're gonna pile up a whole bunch of them. But you are required to keep those, and we as the firm are required to keep them. But what I would say to you, as the firm, we're required to keep about 12 or 13 different ones, but you're going to have information like notes and texts or whatever that you will have in your opportunity or in a file folder. So keep those, because every now and then you might get called into a complaint 3 years after you've done the transaction. And often that's when they get ready to sell if you sold a house to a buyer, they get around they want to sell it. 3 years later, they find something that seems to be a discrepancy. So they'll come back to you. So that's a practical reason for you to hold on to all the information in a file folder, not just the ones that we would keep on hand. Okay. Last week, we talked about listings, and we talked about a pre-listing package where we actually got some of the forms together and presented it. That we didn't deliver it, but we send it over in our e-signature program. We send it to the seller, or you can deliver at the front door, but just don't talk to them, that kind of stuff. Well, with the buyer, it's the same 2-step process, but it's called a buyer consultation. So in a buyer consultation, let me get up to the beginning of this. In a buyer consultation, you're going to basically, you want to find out what they want. I guess you've heard, just like the rest of us, that sales is not all about talking. Sales is a lot about listening. And so you have to learn how to listen. And when you have a buyer consultation, and the reason we suggest this, and I know sometimes buyers just want to see the house. They don't want to talk to you about paperwork. They just want to see the house. But if you can set an appointment, let them meet you at the office or Starbucks or McDonald's, wherever, but preferably at the office, because you want to set that professional tone with your client. So you want to find out what they really are looking for. And you've heard people say buyers are liars. It's not that they mean to be, they think they want one thing, but when they walk into a house and they fall in love with it, it might be exactly opposite of what they told you. They may have told you they want a ranch and they fall in love with this 2-story that has a bedroom on the first floor, or vice versa. Or they tell you they don't want acreage, and yet they go buy a house that has 2.5 acres. We all have seen that. But at the same token, you want to start where they are, and you want to listen to where they are. And some people in their consultation, as they're talking to buyers, they will say, okay, what's the top 5 things you're looking for in a house? Other people look, this is a very simplified questionnaire. Again, I have probably 20 different questionnaires, and get a little bit larger so you can see. We have several different ones from and Ignite. You'll probably get another one. The questionnaires are nothing in the world but just a help for you to know what questions or some questions that you want to ask. You might just be one of these people who can, off the top of your head, ask what they want and jot it down. Others of us, particularly as we're just getting started, we're going to want to know, well, what questions do I need to ask? Well, this is a good guide as to what questions. And when you're talking to them and they give you an answer, make sure they see you write something down. They know you don't have a photographic memory, or maybe you do, but it shows respect for them that when they answer, you're jotting it down. This, like I said, this is just one. If you want some others, I'll be able to supply those for you too. But one of the most important things that you want to know right here is it easiest to contact you by phone, text, or email? You want to have all 3 probably, but you also want to know, how do they want to be communicated with? Okay, so like I said, that's just an example. Now, one thing you must present, and you'll remember this from pre-licensing, your first substantial contact with someone, it's your responsibility to disclose what you do as an agent working with clients. This is your disclosure. It has nothing to do with them. This is you saying to the buyer, the way we in North Carolina work, and specifically in our firm, we work as in the buyer agency, a single agency. We can work in a dual agency role or a designated agency role. But the first thing you want to point out to them is this right here. This is not a contract. I wish they had put a big bold, maybe highlighted it or something, because people are so scared, particularly right at first, that you're going to have them sign something, then they're going to commit to something they didn't want to commit to. But you want to make sure this is just a disclosure of what you want to say to them, and it's not a contract. And when you ask them to sign it, it is strictly to say that you gave it to them. Okay, and that also says at the bottom of the form. Now, when you are in a transaction, you're going to be in this capacity as a single agent, just representing, at this point, we're talking about buyers. So you would only represent that buyer in a single agency. That's how most transactions are happen. There is something called dual agency. The dual agency is when the firm is allowed to be a dual agent, but you as an individual also may be an individual dual agent. There are some people who say, but I'm hiring you to work for me. I don't want you to work for both the seller and the buyer. And in that case, you say, well, we have a solution for that too. It's called designated dual agency. And what that means is the firm will be a dual agent. And if another agent with our firm comes to write an offer, or if they have the listing and you're taking the buyer, then each of y'all can be designated to represent your respective clients, but the firm is still a dual agent. But you can work exclusively for that client, whether it's a buyer or a seller. And we see that a lot in our firm, because we have 500 agents, so we have a lot of listings. And although we haven't had that many in the last few months because of the seller's market, but you want to help a buyer to understand they definitely want to be able to see all of our listings. And unless we are allowed to be a dual agent as a firm, there's no reason to even to see that listing because you can't write an offer on it. Okay, so you don't want to go in great detail right now, just expose them to it. We will go in more detail as we talk about the buyer's agency agreement. Okay, right here, where it says unrepresented buyer, this would be a buyer that's not going to hire you. Most of the time, an unrepresented buyer wants to work with the listing agent because they think the listing agent will not charge them that buyer's agent fee and they'll get the advantage of it. Well, guess what? The seller thinks the same thing. The seller says, oh, good, there's no buyer's agency, so I don't have to pay that extra amount of money. So you still have to go into negotiations, but by and large, you want to make sure that unless the buyer hires an agent, then they're not going to have any representation in the transaction. They can't have their cake and eat it too, as they say. Now, right here on the bottom is where you're going to have the buyer sign that you gave it to them. And that's all really is involved here, that you gave it to them and you gave them a brief overview. Then you sign it here, put your license number and the firm name. This is something that you need to keep with everyone that you present it to. Again, just put you one file folder or maybe set up an opportunity and put all these in it. Maybe you didn't go any further than this one conversation. Sometimes we don't, but at least if you can show that you have it, if the commission comes in to audit us, then we would come and say, let me see all of your working with real estate agent disclosures, okay? But we definitely need it in every opportunity when you proceed forward. But remember, they can ask if you have some that didn't proceed forward. Now, I'm going to show you a couple of diagrams, I guess what you would say. I'm a visual person and I have this habit of I kind of remember back in, I don't guess it was junior high school when you used to diagram sentences. I kind of have to diagram contracts and diagram things so I can see where things are going. So when our due diligence contract first came out, we got some of our brightest agents to do some diagrams for us. I'm not going to show you mine. Mine's pretty homegrown, but one of the agents did this for us. So if you have an overview yourself of where you're going, then you can lead that buyer. You just didn't realize you were going to become a leader when you became an agent, but you are. You, in every transaction, you must be the leader. And I don't mean that you're going to force people to do things, but you're going to guide. Guiding is different from steering. Guiding is giving them information and giving them the path to make their decisions to go forward. Now, in our due diligence contract, you've got 3 phases with this little overview. You've got 3 phases, and in these 3 phases, the first phase, I'm going to reduce this just a little bit. Now we can see a little bit better. You're going to go over, obviously, the work with real estate agents. You're going to get your employment agreement, and that's the buyer's agency agreement. That's during that consultation I told you about. If you don't have a chance to do a consultation and you do meet the buyer before you ever write an offer to purchase, you must have a buyer's agency agreement. That buyer's agency agreement gives you the right to write the offer to purchase. If you don't know who you represent, then you can't write that offer. Okay. So if you know that you have the buyer's agency agreement in place, and we're going to go through that in a minute, then you have the authority by that buyer to write the offer to purchase to his benefit. Okay. You're going to want to help the buyer to know that they've got to find a lender. It is so recommended and such a benefit to have a buyer talk to a lender even before you start looking for houses, but certainly during the time you look for houses. Then you want to get them to make an application for loans. Sometimes they won't actually make the formal application until they get under contract, which is okay. But you want them talking with the lender, because listing agents are going to ask for what's called pre-approval letters.
Mhm.
And particularly in multiple offer situations, which we've been having so many of this last year, then that can make a difference in winning the bid, is that pre-approval letter. So you want to definitely get them talking to the lender at the same time you're showing houses. The pre-approval letter, a pre-approval letter is subject not only to the contract, but it's subject to the house, the appraisal of the house. So the buyer has to qualify, and so does the house, quite honestly. So as you're going through this, this is the first stage or phase of doing your contract. Now, these are some of the addendums and some of the things. Again, we're going to go through all this, but I just want to give you an overview as to what you're going to do in phase one. Once you get here, once you get through the work of the real estate agents, we get through our buyer's agency, then you're going to go into what's called a due diligence period. The due diligence period, and I'll go through this again, that's that period of time where inspections are done. There's about 12 things, and they're itemized in the offer to purchase, that a buyer must do during due diligence if they are doing their full due diligence. All right. They evaluate the property in every angle, every way they can evaluate it to decide if they're going to proceed forward past that due diligence. There is a fee charged for that period of time, and that's called a DDF, or due diligence fee. The purpose of that due diligence fee is to purchase a period of time. It's almost like renting the house for a period of time, so that you can have the access to do your inspections. You have the time to do any and every aspect, like a survey, or you want to check, your buyer would check out the CCRs, the restrictions in a neighborhood. They're going to check on special assessments. They're investigating the property. But what that DDF fee really entails, other than buying that period of time, is for the buyer to have the right to terminate for any and no reason. A due diligence fee is for the purpose of the buyer having the right to terminate that contract for any or no reason. There are a lot of buyers get buyer's remorse. They'll 2 or 3 days after they bought the house, they're going, oh no, what have I done? I can't buy this house. Well, that's a no reason, but they still owe the due diligence fee. And sometimes they don't want to do that because they think, well, I told you in 2 days. It doesn't matter. Once the contract has been signed, the offer has been signed, it becomes a contract, and it's a binding contract. And so a buyer doesn't have the option of not paying the due diligence fee at that time in order to terminate the contract. And anyway, that's an exception. We'll talk about that another time. But right now, the main thing is so that you understand that there is a due diligence period and there's a due diligence fee. Now, during the due diligence period, this is phase 2. This is DDP, or due diligence period. All of these things are things that need to be checked out. Again, it's all itemized in the contract, but for you, you're right. You can explain this, but as much as anything, I want you to know it. I want you to be explaining it, but whether you give this to a client or not is irrelevant. It's helpful to some people, but you have got to have in your mind, what's the next step? Where are we going? What do we need to do in this phase or stage of our transaction? Then you want to come right here and look. This is the most important thing that you need to be keeping in your mind. And if I were you, I would have make sure that every transaction I have a notice to remind myself the day that ends due diligence. On the due diligence end date, it ends at 5 p.m. And as we often say, it's 5 p.m. somewhere, but in North Carolina, due diligence ends at 5 p.m. North Carolina time. Okay. So if the buyer happens to be in California and he wants to send it to you another time, that don't work. Okay. It's got to be 5 o'clock in North Carolina time. When the due diligence period ends at 5 p.m., if the listing agent has not received your termination from your buyer is going to be in deep trouble because they're going to go on to closing. They will have lost their right to terminate at 5 p.m. So and you see right here, it says time being of the essence, that means it's over, guys. You know, that there's no grace period. There's no 5 minutes grace. It's 5 o'clock. And at 5:01, the buyer has lost the opportunity to terminate for any or no reason. Now, there may be some other reasons that he terminates, but he doesn't have a right to terminate beyond that time. Now, phase 3, once you get past this due diligence period, this is where the lender finishes their work, gets the loan approved through the underwriter, the loan package, as they call it. All the paperwork has to be sent to the attorney. The attorney and the lender work together to produce what's called a settlement statement, or a CD. And there is a CD, closing disclosure, that's prepared for the buyer and one prepared for the seller. If you're representing the buyer, your buyer and you do not see the one that was prepared for the seller. And because we do need some information off of both sides, there's something called an ALTA, A-L-T-A. And the ALTA is what the attorney will give you to bring back to the office with your commission check so that you can get paid. That ALTA is the closing statement that the attorney prepares. It's more generic. Then it doesn't give any specifics of the buyer's information on it. Okay. Now, when you go to your closing, what we for generations have called closing, in North Carolina, that's really a settlement date. That's the day that the buyer and the sellers sign all the paperwork, but that's not considered closing in North Carolina. There's 4 steps to closing in North Carolina. There is these steps right here. You've got to transfer the satisfactory title. That's called, that would be when the attorney does the final title search. They do a title search before settlement. And then right before the deed is recorded, they do one more title search to make sure nothing has popped up that they didn't see before. Then they are going to talk with the lender. The lender is going to release the funds, release the money. So now it's going to be in the attorney's trust account. Once the money is in the attorney's trust account, then the attorney is going to record the deed. When he records the deed, then it's considered closed, because the ownership now has transferred with the recording of the deed. Not signing of the deed, it's the recording of the deed. They're signed the deed, obviously, at settlement. So when the deed is recorded, that's when the attorney will disperse the checks, your check, the seller's checks, whoever he needs to pay. And then that's when we distribute keys. You do not distribute keys at the settlement table. And that's an alarming thing to a lot of buyers, because for years, that's where you go to closing and you sit across the table and you share your keys and the garage door openers, and you put the buyer puts the money on the table, his down payment, and that's not the way it goes anymore. The keys do not go to the buyer until the seller knows that ownership has been transferred by the recording of the deed. Now, having said that, occasionally there are a few sellers that will let that happen, but it's up to the seller. So you want to make sure for your buyer, when you get to head into a closing, when they can get the keys, okay? Now, right here, look at this little section right here. This is important. If either party, for whatever reason, can't go to settlement on the date that's in the contract, there's a 7-day grace period. That's not time is the essence. There's a 7-day grace period. If for whatever reason that loan package is not ready, maybe there's a what they call a cloud on the title, maybe that something has to be solved with a lien against the title. Sometimes it's not possible. Usually it's a third party that causes it not to be possible to close. So you have up to 7 days built into the contract that you do not have to get all parties to agree to extend those extra days. So you've got a little grace period. You're going to be communicating a lot between the agents and the parties, but you don't have to get any paperwork. You can have up to those 7 days. Okay, now that's a broad overview of the offer to purchase. Okay, now this other little this little format here, this is another way of explaining, and I do think this is a good, well, I think both of them are good to give to buyers, but you don't have to. But this again itemizes a little bit, or gives a little bit more focus on the due diligence fee and when it's expected. The due diligence fee has to be paid right up front when you're doing a contract, the due diligence fee, and it's paid directly to the seller. It doesn't go to the attorney. The same time, you're going to have the earnest money that's going to stay in the attorney's trust account right to the day of closing. When he disperses all the other funds, the earnest money will be dispersed. Okay, so right here, it basically says the due diligence fee and earnest money will be credited to the buyer. Remember a while ago, I said, if they miss that 5 p.m. date right here of paying, of getting the either the terminating or not terminating by 5 p.m., they're going to closing. Well, if they don't terminate right here, which ends the due diligence period, then that money will be credited to them. Even though the seller already has part of it, it's still credited on those CD, the closing statements. So that this is like the way Joshua Hong wrote, drew this for us, and the way he did it is more or less half and half. You don't generally have half of the period of time for the due diligence and half a period of time to finish the closing. What you want to do is have a little bit longer period of time for your due diligence, as long as the seller will let you. When we were first taught this form, they said you want to allow at least 21 days. On a 30-day closing, you want about 21 days in your due diligence period. And that should give the seller, excuse me, give the buyer the time to do their due diligence and do their investigations and make up their mind. And then the rest of that period of time, up to 30 days, would be to finalize everything and get the loan package done, that phase 3. So again, that is all over the board right now. These last few months, as we've worked with these multiple offers and we've worked with trying to get deals together, one of the ways that they got some offers through was to have a shorter period of time on due diligence. And unfortunately, some of them even gave up their right for due diligence, or they were paying excessive amounts of money for due diligence. A due diligence fee, initially we were told it should be equal to about a month's rent. And if you wanted 21 days, was that 3 weeks? So you would divide the month's rent in 4 and pay 3 weeks of it. That was the scale, I guess they taught us early on, because it is like renting the house. That has gone out the window during these last few months. The DDFs have been so excessive. I mean, it's nauseating to see what some people were willing to risk and what they paid. When they risked those high due diligence fees, basically what they were saying to the seller is, we're going to close. So, you know, we're going to get our money back when we close, but we're going to close. And they were trying to make the sellers choose them because they were not going to choose to walk away for any or no reason. Because who's going to walk away from many, many thousands of dollars? We saw some that had due diligence fees of over $100,000. Who has that kind of money they can risk? I mean, there were a number of people, and they weren't necessarily the $1 million homes. I mean, they might have been 700,000 or 800,000, but you would have thought that they might risk that over $1 million homes. We saw many homes in the 600s that were having anywhere from $40,000 to $60,000 in due diligence fee. Well, that scares the bejeebies out of me, you know, but that was what we were seeing, because these people were so either, I don't want to use the word desperate, determined, maybe I should say, to get that house, you know. So all that to say, it's not generally half and half of the period of time of closing. So that gives you a little explanation. So that, again, that's a graphic that hopefully will be helpful to you to show somebody or for your understanding. Now, this is your buyer's agency agreement. The main thing that I want to point out, I'm not going to spend a great deal of time on it. Just do want to point out 3 or 4 things that are critically important. Here, when you put the buyer's name, the attorneys really like for you to do the legal names. You can put Bubba Smith. It's not going to hurt anything, but John Robert Smith IV might be better to use as the buyer's name. And right here, this is the firm name. This is going to be Keller Williams Ballantine area. And you don't have to put Keller Williams Ballantine area - Danielle Clinton. You don't have to put your name. Okay, you are the representing the firm, so you don't have to put your name there. It's just the firm name. Now take a note and look right here. If the buyer is not just an individual, if the buyer is a corporation, an LLC, which would be a limited liability company, a trust, or other legal entity, the entity should be named as the buyer. So if, let's say, the buyer is Danielle Clinton Trust, or trust of Danielle Clinton, then you would put the name of the trust, or you would put the name of the LLC. And because the LLC or trust is the one who's going to take ownership. Now, if your buyer is not going to buy in their individual name, you need to see something in writing that gives them the authority to purchase something for the LLC. LLCs usually have a manager. They have what's called a member manager. If they are members of the LLC, they do not have the right to sign on behalf of the LLC. It must be a qualified representative. And same thing with a corporation. So you're going to want to ask the buyer to provide you something before you write the offer to purchase. Don't necessarily have to do it with the buyer's agency, but before you write the offer to purchase, you want something in there. They don't have to show you all their papers, but there'll be a couple of pages that they can pull out to show you that they have the authority to bind the LLC to this agreement. This little thing right here, I can't tell you how important this paragraph is. Sometimes when I'm doing it manually, if I'm sitting talking to a buyer, I will just draw me a little line right here and I get them to initial it, just to say, I talked to you about this paragraph. You see it's in bold. The important thing is, on a buyer's agency agreement, sometimes they forget that they've signed an agreement with somebody else. So here you are sitting talking to a buyer, and you getting ready to get in your car, and one of our well-known instructors in town calls it hauling and hoping. You know, you go hauling that buyer all around town, hoping they're going to buy something. And they may be in a buyer's agency agreement with somebody else. Then what are you gonna do? Well, you probably don't even gonna know anything about it because they're gonna say, no, I haven't signed anything else. No, I'm free and clear, so you go ahead to start working with them. And then you get this telephone call when somebody finds out that they're working with another buyer's agent. Next thing you know, you are going to be called into on an ethics violation, or you're going to be asked to share some of your commission. So that's why I think it's really important that buyers know if they've signed something else, they are obligating themselves to 2 commissions. So you make it about them. It's not about you, but it is about you, but you make it about them. You see, if you have worked with another agent and you sign paperwork with that other agent, let's just don't go any further until you make sure that you're not in a relationship with another firm. You need to call the broker in charge of that other firm and get that agreement terminated before I can actually help you. Otherwise, if I help you buy a house and they've got an agency agreement with you too, then you are obligated to 2 commissions. And I wouldn't want to do that to you. So let's get up front with each other and make sure that you're taken care of. And that's the way you take care of yourself. Now, there's some red flags. Every now and then you're talking to a buyer and the buyer said, well, I'm not working with anybody. I haven't worked with anybody several months, but a few months ago, we did make an offer on a couple of houses and multiple offers and we didn't get it. Red light should go off in your brain. What does that say? They had to have had a buyer's agency agreement with the person who wrote those 2 offers, right? Or they couldn't have written the offers. So that's when you, like I say, the red light went off for you and you say, are you sure you are not still in agreement, in that agreement? Get your copy out and find out before we go too much further, okay? So that's a little red light for you to cause you to think that they might have worked with somebody else. Okay, any agreement has to have a beginning and an end, and right here is where you have your term. You're going to start, generally you're going to start the day you're talking, their effective date. Then there's 2 options here. One is if they are just looking for a home, they're looking for one property. The second option is maybe they are investors, or maybe they want to buy a house and maybe one for mama, So if they're going to buy more than one property, you check here. More than one here and just one here. All right. And on this date, that will be the end of your agreement. If you close on a property prior to that date, the closing date becomes the end and you're not under any further obligation to that buyer. All right. Otherwise it terminates. Now, if you need to extend that, there is a form to be able to do that, and it's form 710. I don't think I have it in this stack, but you would have that form and you can extend it if you need to. Most of the time people will go at least 4 months on the buyer's agency and maybe 6 months on the listing agreement, but it's up to you how long you put on there. The compensation to the firm for a buyer, traditionally and for years, we put 3% right in here. Oh, by the way, let me show you here. Retainer fee, we don't do a retainer fee. So this is going to be an NA. But right here, the fee for service, it can be 3%. It can be 2.5%. It's whatever the buyer is willing to pay or have you be paid. It's a disclosure. And right here, it tells how we're going to try to get our fee. We want to get our fee from the MLS primarily. And one of the reasons you're a member of the MLS is that you can be guaranteed the amount of compensation that's advertised in Canopy or your MLS. So that's the first thing that you're going to be, the first place you're going to be looking for. But what you want to help a buyer to understand is there are times in the days we are right now, and this again, something we've not dealt with in 20 years, there are times that some listing firms or the listing agent is not offering a very nice compensation. We're seeing some 1%, 1.5%, $4,000 flat from the builders. And through the years, we've more or less grown to expect a 6% commission and 3% to the buyers. That is not happening as much right now as we would like. So if your buyer agrees for you to have 3% as your compensation, you might need to go back to the buyer. If they choose a house that's only offering 1.5%, you have the option to go back to the buyer and ask them to make up the difference. Some agents do, some agents don't. It's up to you. But you would want to make the buyer aware that if the house they choose, let's say they go to Ryan Homes where they're only offering $4,000, no matter what the price of the house is. One of our agents should have had a $17,000 commission, and she wound up going $4,000 because that's all they would offer. And so she did go back to her, and fortunately her buyer was willing to make up the difference. Shock, shock. I mean, that was a lot of money, but because of the day that we're living in right now, there's 4 lawsuits going on against the National Association of Realtors, and they're going on by their class action suits saying that sellers should not have to pay the buyer's agents. Buyers should pay the buyer's agents. And we don't know what's going to happen with these. This has been going on for about 2 years. So as a result, the commissions are much more negotiable than they've ever been. And the listing agents are not offering half anymore. They're not offering what sometimes is something you want to accept. So I had that long discussion with you because that's happening today is what you're dealing with. Occasionally you'll get extra compensation. Not often, but builders sometimes will give you a bonus. And if they give you a bonus, you have to tell the buyer that you're getting a bonus. And I got to tell you, they're going to want it. And because they think, why should you get it? I'm the one that's buying the house. So the form that you need to use is Form 770, and it's noted right here. If you are going to get a bonus, you do have to disclose it to your buyer. And now right here, this is what's called a protection period. And often we'll put 60 or 90 days in there. That protection period is just to take care of you. If your buyer goes and buys a house from somebody else, not another buyer's agent, but like I said, the FSBO, then you can possibly get your commission out of it. And that's what that's for. It's basically to say you shouldn't do that. But I got to tell you, it doesn't have a lot of weight when it comes to the legal process. Now, if you want to come on down here, firm's duties, there's basically those 5. If you'll remember in pre-licensing, you had fiduciary duties. Your fiduciary duties still hold water. You still got to do your fiduciary duties, but this is just spelled out in terms a little bit more user-friendly than fiduciary, okay? This basically tells you have the right to disclose the buyer's name and address. Now, this was an area that was highlighted. Obviously, it's bold and capitalized. And I don't know if you've heard something called love letters. A lot of buyers through the years have written a letter to the seller so that the seller would identify with them, and they would know that it would warm their heart that maybe they would choose them over another offer. And that has happened, I know. Love letters are no longer to be used. You as a buyer's agent are not to be carrying a love letter to a listing agent, because now they're saying that there's violations of the fair housing laws, and we can't determine if this is a violation of the law. So the way we don't determine it is that we don't do it. If they want to get a love letter to the seller, they got to find another way. We're not going to be carrying it because of that. And they're really, state regulations are basically saying, stay away from it. And so they added this warning this past, I guess it was July a year ago, in regards to this. Now, these are the buyer's duties to you. You want to help them to understand that we can't give them legal advice. We're going to direct them to an attorney if it's beyond the scope of what we do as realtors. Now, see this little thing right here. It says the buyer acknowledges receipt of a sample copy. It's a sample copy. It has to have the watermark or sample, and I got a couple in here for you, so you'll have it. The home warranty, we often do offer a warranty to the buyers, or give them information on it anyway, because they want it, but we do not take a fee for doing that. We can order it and we can have the information sent to the attorney, but we do not charge a fee for that. Now, then you come down here and this is where you're going to give a more thorough explanation of dual agency. It's written out pretty clearly, but this is where you're going to talk again about the firm being a dual agent. You can be an individual dual agent if they don't mind, but if they do want exclusive, we've got to go the designated agent route. And the way you do specify that is this little pattern right here. This is a new, actually it's a new format. They just did this format in July. Look right up here. This is what's really important, where the buyer does or does not authorize the same individual agent, you as the buyer's agent, to represent both the buyer and the seller. Sometimes you might do an open house as a listing agent and a buyer comes in, then that would throw you into the potential individual dual agency. If the buyer's already working with another agent, obviously that's no problem. But if they're not, they want you to write the contract, then you've got to get them to agree for you to be the individual. I wouldn't recommend, as a new agent, you trying to do the individual dual agency. I would recommend, if you have a buyer comes in and they want you to, call me and I'll help you find another agent, and I'll designate, the BIC has to designate another agent to represent the buyer in that situation, or listing seller. And right down here where it talks about exclusive representation, this is where if they check that, all cooperating within Keller Williams Valentine is off the chart. Okay, so just make sure these are the options that come under dual agency, and this is if no dual agency is allowed with any of the agents in KW. The dual agency compensation, if they do allow it, that's not going to change. So dual agency is going to be what it is on the listing agreement and what is offered in MLS. Terminations, this is if they breach the contract in some way, this is the consequences. And now you make sure that you do go over the wire fraud warning. Oh, we're still losing millions of dollars a year on the wire fraud warning, or the wire frauds. So you want to make sure that you talk to them about wire fraud. And again, when you get to this page, this is where you're going to get their names and their signatures. And I do want you to get the information as to the contact, where they live, their fax, their cell phones, all the numbers here. Now, if it's an entity, a while ago we were talking about a trust or an LLC. If it's an entity, you don't fill anything out up here. Right here is where you're going to put the entity's name, and right here's the signature of the person who is authorized to sign for that entity. This is that person's name printed, and here's the title. Remember, I mentioned that it might be a manager of an LLC who has the right to bind that LLC to this contract. So that would most likely be the LLC manager. Okay. And again, a mailing address for the entity or for that person. You've always got to be putting the firm number, firm license number, and your individual license number. And if you want to write it down, the firm license number is capital C 13291. It's capital C 13291. And of course, you're going to know your own individual number. You're going to say it a lot of times. You're going to know it. But you do have to put that on your buyer agency agreement.
I'm sorry, can you say that one more time?
Oh,
Capital-
sure. Capital C 13291.
Thank you.
Now that's your North Carolina firm license. South Carolina is different. It's 10902. But right now we're not talking about South Carolina. I do South Carolina forms next week and the following week if any of you have your South Carolina license already. I don't think you do. Now I told you I was just giving you some sample copies. This is a sample copy of the offer to purchase. You see the watermark. You can't give a form like this out that if it doesn't have the watermark or at least write on the top of the pages sample, because we can't let just anybody use the form. Okay, so I gave you a copy of the offer to purchase, and again, you can give that to the buyer so they know what they're going to be signing. And then there's this other form called professional services. Okay, come on. There it is, professional services disclosure. See, when the buyer is doing all that due diligence, these are most of the things that they're going to be doing. And you want them to have the right to waive it if they're not going to have it done. If they are going to have it done, you want initials that they're going to get done. And this is really important, that column on the order by. Sometimes they want you to order it. If they want you to order it, you want to have the direction right here. Not 2 weeks ago, I had a situation where the buyer wanted the agent to order an HVAC inspection. That buyer didn't close on the property. And guess whose name's on the order for the HVAC tech? And now the agent did not have this signed. So the agent has to pay for the order that has her name on it. And she didn't have direction from she had a verbal, the buyer, and she had no reason to think the buyer wasn't going to pay, wasn't going to go forward. She trusted the buyer. Now she has no legal ground. The buyer saying, I'm not closing on that house. Why should I pay that? So she's paying $117. So all that to say, if she had this form and they selected an HVAC, it's on down here, and ordered by the agent, but the buyer signed it, giving that direction, then she'd be off the hook. Okay, now that's all that I pretty well go through as far as forms with your buyer consultation. Got any questions on those? Your mind said, well, I wish I could think of a question, but right now I'm trying to think of all the things that, that went into it. Now, this is your first step. Like I said, this would be your buyer consultation that you would have. Now, let's go on to the next step.
I have a question.
Oh, okay. Hey.
Yes. So I have a situation where I have a potential buyer who is wanting to do purchase under the LLC. What specific information / documentation would I want to see from them?
Okay. If your buyer doesn't have a copy themselves, you can go to the Secretary of State in North Carolina. It's either SOSNC or NCSOS. I can't remember. But you can Google the Secretary of State, North Carolina, and you can actually look it up by the name of the LLC. And they will there's some PDFs in there of the articles of incorporation. I think they call it articles of organization for an LLC, and it'll tell you there.
So what I need to put that I guess maybe put that in their file, or do I just need to verify for myself?
I would go ahead and you can copy that out. I'd put it in the file because see, the attorney's going to have it too.
Okay.
So I would just go ahead and put it in the opportunity in your file. That's a good idea.
Okay.
That's a good question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Cool. All right. Now, this is my little colorful checklist. The checklist, you're going to see a number of checklists. These are the checklists that we can print out and kind of take a look at. There's a checklist that's going to be in your opportunity when you're putting forms in there. It's going to tell you which forms, that you can put in. There, like I said, there are a number of checklists you can follow, but this is the one by and large for the buyer sale, as you can see right up there, buyer sale. This is more or less the steps that you're going to go through with, and some forms that are available at each step. And if you'll notice, I made sure not only give the title, I have the number of the North Carolina form. This is the copyright date, the last date that, and these are the, it's important in both states, but it's even more critical, I think, in the North Carolina side, because South Carolina doesn't do it as systematic as North Carolina. You want to have the most current version of the copyright date. So I put these on there for you. These are just like a little cheat sheet, but you don't have to use these. This is just available to you if you want to. What you do have to use is the one in command, all right? The buyer agency agreement, that's the number, that's the date. You're going to get this signed, obviously. There may be such a thing as an unrepresented seller agreement. Don't really, you don't have that many of those right now. Every now and then you'll find sellers trying to sell their own homes. And if they are for sale by owner, you can represent the buyer. You can use this form to get the seller to say how much he's going to pay you as the agent to work with him. And then you can continue to represent your buyer. You don't ever represent the seller in that case, but you do get the seller's agreement to work with you and for whatever amount of money. So if you get a seller that's selling their own home, you must use this form right here, Form 150. All right. The non-exclusive buyer's agency, that typically is with an investment buyer who wants to buy multiple properties. Your offer to purchase, this is your primary sales contract. There's two in North Carolina. One is for the residents. There's one for land, vacant land. Well, there's actually three. There's for a new construction, but most of the time a new construction, you're going to use the builder's contracts. They're going to have the sales rep, this is the model home, and they're going to do their own. Every now and then, some of the smaller builders do not have their own contract, and you might use that, but primarily you're going to use 2T, which is the residential contract, and this is for land, 12T. All right. Again, this is just some little notes about these contracts. You might have you have different buyers. Not everybody is just out buying their own home. Some people some people are going to have a relocation service. Maybe they've been transferred by a company, and if they are working with a relocation company, they're going to have specific addendums that are given to them by that relocation company. So if you're working with a business person who is being transferred here, one of the first questions you want to ask is, are you working with a relocation company? Because that may or may not allow you to work with them, first of all. And the relocation companies require quite a hefty little sharing of your commission, anywhere from 37 or 38% to maybe 52%. So you definitely want to know if that buyer is working with a relocation company, all right? And to know that you have to have addendas with them. Sometimes you sell a house that's being sold by a seller who has those addenda that you're still going to have to use, all right? REO addendum, that's a real estate owned. That would be a bank owned property. We're not seeing those that much right now, and I hope we don't see those anytime soon. Sometimes you'll see an attorney drafted. You're not to sign an addendum if the agent wrote it out. An attorney drafted addendum, you might have your buyer sign and put that in with the contract. Now, the first 3 days after you get those signed documents, you need to submit them for review to our compliance department. That doesn't mean that they're going to review it immediately, but by law in North Carolina, you have to submit those within 3 days. You need to give copies of those to the buyer. Anything the buyer signs, you need to give them a copy, and you need to turn it into the office. Now, when you're doing your opportunity in command, there is a little button up on the right-hand side that says submit for review. And you don't need to do it until you get your offer to purchase. But once you get that, you want to submit it for review. Then you're going to have some other documents. And again, you're coming down this side of the page and then going over on the other side. And all of these pages, these are things that are going to be done during that period of time from you got your initial offer until you get to close it. And what I suggest is about 3 days, at least 3 days before closing, make sure that you got all your paperwork in, because you get paid as soon as you bring in the commission check if your documentation's in. We can't pay you if we don't have all the right documentation. So it's important that you learn to do these forms, get them in a timely way. And about, like I said, about 3 days out, just do one final check, make sure you're good so that you get paid very quickly. When you do go to closing, you're going to bring that CD or that closing disclosure back to Lynn Davis, who is our administrator. And when you turn that in with the check, then she processes it based upon making sure that everything's been turned in. Every now and then you'll have what I hate is terminations. I don't like terminations. I want you all to get paid. And but there are times that you have to have terminations, and these are primarily the termination forms that you would use. I'll have a whole session on terminations pretty soon, but today we're not going to go through that. I'm not going to go through those forms with you right now. I want to get on down. Now, last week, I know some of you weren't with us, but Evelyn was, and we went through the residential property and owners association disclosure. Before you write your offer, look at the listing in MLS, look at attachments. Hopefully you'll have the residential property disclosure and you'll have the mineral oil and gas rights disclosure. Those two, it's the best thing ever to have those available to you immediately so that you can give those right to your buyer at the time you're writing the offer. Then that eliminates the potential of a buyer being able to terminate within 3 days because they didn't get it. So it's prudent on your part to make sure they have it. If it's not attached to the listing, I would be calling that listing agent and said, I want that residential property disclosure and that mineral oils and gas. I'm writing an offer. So make sure you have it. I'm not going to go through this today because I want to go to the offer to purchase, but make sure, the reason I put it in here is to make sure you all know to get it, because you've got to have those two. This is your, again, this form tells you about the condition of the property according to the seller, and it tells you the information about the HOA according to the seller. This is not something that agents can fill out. This is something the seller fills out. The one thing you do want to keep in mind is if the agent knows any material fact that the seller chose not to disclose, the agent has to tell. If this was under contract before and they got an inspection report that says there's moisture higher than allowed in the crawl space, that agent has to disclose it, even if the seller says, don't you tell anybody, because the seller doesn't want to tell, the agent still has to tell. All right. So just be aware, if you're the listing agent, you might have to tell too. But we're not seeing quite as much of the agent getting in trouble for that as much as we are sellers misrepresenting the condition of the property. Now go on down here. That right there's the information about the HOA. Here is your other form. in 40 years, I have never seen the word mandatory in the title of a form other than this form. And we started using this form about 4 years ago. This, I think they mean for you to use it. Look right here. I told you there were a few forms that were produced by the lawmakers, by the Senate, the state. This is the seal. And you see that? That means the state lawmakers say you better get this filled out. Okay. All buyers need to have a right to this from the sellers. Remember I mentioned a minute ago about a for sale by owner? Even those who choose to sell the house by themselves, they are responsible to give these forms to the buyer. All right. So if you're representing a buyer, you make sure you get these forms for your buyer. Now here we are with the offer to purchase. This is the thing that we stay in business for, because this is where we get paid. The offer to purchase, again, as I gave you the overview a while ago, when you finally choose that one house, you're going to have your MLS sheet. You're going to print out the tax record for that particular property. And when you're looking at the MLS, up in the right-hand corner, there's a hyperlink. You know where it has a little blue line? There's a hyperlink. If you click on that, the underline is several numbers. It'll take you directly to that tax record for that property. So look on your MLS, click on your hyperlink, go directly and print out your tax record. Then in MLS, down under the pictures, it looks like a stack of papers. You click on that stack of papers, that's where you find the attachments. Hopefully, the attachments would include your residential property and the owners association disclosure, the mineral, oil, and gas rights. Hopefully that's there. If the house is older than 1978, remember, you have to have a lead-based disclosure. Hopefully that would be there. You might even have measurements, a sketch to show the measurements, because in MLS, you are required to have accurate square footage. The Real Estate Commission doesn't require us to have square footage. Individual MLSs do. The rules of the MLS, and Canopy is one of them. And there are some who ask for a range. Some don't ask for square footage at all. But our MLS requires a number for square footage. So listing agents generally hire someone who professionally measures. We have a company that one of our agents actually started years ago that does, I don't know how many thousands he does a month, he and his crew. But that's about the best $100 you can spend on a listing, is to get it professionally measured. That way you have someone who does it more often. They're very skilled, they're trained, and that keeps you from having to have disputes on the square footage, which is a really big. One of the attorneys told me the other day that they had a dispute over square footage, and it seems like it was about the size of maybe a garage. I can't, because I remember him saying, and I made the comment, well, that's the size of a double car garage. Obviously, it had to be somewhere around 440 square feet. That buyer wound up getting $20,000 for that difference. So you don't want that. So make sure, listing agents, that you get it professionally measured. You as buyer's agents, get a grasp of it and look for, see if they have this the sketch up there of the house. Okay, they may or may not have something called a septic permit. If they don't have a septic permit attached, and if it says its own septic, you're going to need to get the septic permit. We do have a form in here to remind you or tell you how to do it as well. There is a number of attachments. Sometimes they have what's called CCRs. Those are your covenants and restrictions in the neighborhood. If they have those, it may be 81 pages. You can email it over to your client, but your client can look like it online, or they can print it out. Having those CCRs before, like I don't know if I told you all of the listing group last week or not, but just last week I was looking at one for a property that one of our agents was going to write an offer on, and we were checking for different things. And as I looked at it, I found out they could not park a service vehicle in that neighborhood. And the man uses a truck in his business, and it has a logo on the side of his company. They can't park that in their driveway. And I mean, how's he supposed to get home from work? Does he park his vehicle down at the, down at the pool and walk up, or what? So this particular fellow agreed to get one of those magnetic things that go over the email, that go over the logo, and they went ahead and bought the house. But what if we hadn't have told them ahead of time? So be sure and scan through those CCRs. So if they don't have them, you want to help your buyer to be able to get those. And the best way to do it is to call the listing agent, get the listing agent to get the seller to do it, because the seller has access. They pay monthly dues to be able to have access to that information. But if you try to get it, the property manager will charge you. So you want to, hopefully it's attached, but you want to get it from the listing agent. If nothing else, pay it and charge and tell the buyer they're going to have to pay you back, because you want to get those. Now you're ready to write your offer. You've got your all these documents ready. You got your MLS, you got your tax records, you got your buyer's agency agreement, and you've got any disclosures that are available. So when you're coming here again, the seller, and you say, well, how am I going to know the seller's name? But I guess, what you reckon is on the tax records? Guess what? There's another place you want to look. The residential property disclosure down on the bottom first page should have the name of the sellers. If it's an entity, it should say there also that it's an entity. Okay, so you want to get the seller's name. Don't leave that blank. All right. At last resort, call the listing agent, but hopefully you can find it out with those two sources. The buyer, again, the buyer's name, we talked about that already. Right in here, this little section, there are some properties that we sell that actually, it's a mobile home with land. The mobile home is has a foundation built on the land, and we can sell a mobile home that has a permanent foundation, because those homes typically have been what they call de-titled. See, a mobile home is like a car. They have a title, and they can't sell that mobile home. We can't until that title is de-titled and it becomes part of the deed then. So if there is a mobile home, just know that you've got to do some extra steps, and you do need to make sure that you note here. And sometimes you might have a residence that maybe they have a mobile home that they had a parent lived in, or some people that worked on the farm or whatever, or different reasons they would have the mobile home in addition to the residence too. So if there is a mobile home included, make sure that you do that, and to note it right there, and also use this form right here to give more information about it. You're going to get this information typically off of your MLS sheet. You're going to verify it with the tax records and make sure they're the same. Occasionally they're not the same, and the reason in most cases they're not the same is this right here, the mail delivery. The post office gives them a different address for postal delivery, but you want to confirm that. You verify, and then if it's a discrepancy, you confirm if that is the reason. The legal description, most of the time you're going to get the legal description from, again, the tax records. In our area, we do not use something called plats. That's just not the way our area denotes properties. We basically have them stored in deed books and page right here in the deed books and page. You're going to get that from the tax records. Okay. Again, you'll, in fact, it'll say deed REF reference, and it's a string of numbers with a hyphen in the middle. You'll have 4 or 5 numbers, a hyphen, and maybe 4 numbers. The deed book is the first set of numbers, the hyphen, and the second set of numbers is the page. So you're going to want to fill this in right here. The other description, that's where you're going to put what we would normally call the legal description. Rarely are you going to have what's called meets and bounds. I don't know if you remember from pre-licensing at a meets and bounds, description is generally this long. And if it is meets and bounds, you make a note there, meets and bounds, and then put the word C attached. And then you would attach a copy of that lengthy description. More times than one, the properties that we sell, you're going to have an L, like L14 and B48 or M, whatever. You're going to see some letters and some numbers, and you want to put it right here. Okay. Now the PID or PIN, that's an identification number. That's your property ID or parcel ID. There's different terminologies, but it's basically that number that's hyperlinked. I was telling you about in your MLS, that's that hyperlink. That's the ID to the tax records. And up here, the only thing you're going to fill in up here is this right here, the subdivision or condominium. If it's a condominium, in this legal description right here, you're going to see the word unit. If it says unit in the legal description, then you know it's a condominium. There's no land being sold with that residence. If it doesn't have unit, it might look like a condominium. It's probably a townhome that might have a little bit of land, but if it has any land at all, it will have a block type of legal description. Now, this right here, this is just arithmetic. And sometimes as we're trying to figure out what to do with this, just realize when you put in a number here, let's say it's 400,000, and the due diligence fee, they're going to do 4,000, and maybe they're going to do another 4,000 for earnest money. So you've got 400,000 minus 4,000 minus another 4,000. So you're going to come all the way down here. And like I said, it's just all it is arithmetic. That's 400,000 minus 8,000. So we, what, 392? So that's what would go here. It does not mean anything about the loan. It is strictly arithmetic of what you're going to pay for the property, anything minused from that, and the balance here. Now let's talk about these things over here. Don't miss these little check boxes. All right. I'm not going to talk about the price that they're going to pay because you're going to do a CMA and help them with price. What I want you to know or be able to help with is this thing right here. The due diligence fee that has to be paid at the time you make the offer. If the actual due date is the executed or effective date. An effective date is the date everybody signs it. So prepare your buyer to be ready to pay that DDF. And if they don't want to give you a check made out to the seller when you make your offer, that's fine. But they better have that check ready because you've got, or they have got to get it to the seller on the effective date. Remember, the effective date is the date that everybody has signed and initialed any changes. If you want a description, it's right here, or not description, a definition. See where it says effective date? You can pull your buyer's attention right over here to these definitions. Here's your definition for effective date. Here's your definition for due diligence fee, due diligence period. It's kind of what I described to you a while ago. This is where it's in black and white, where you can show them the definition. Now back up here, when the due diligence fee is made payable and delivered to the seller by the effective date, here's 4 options that can be used. They can do cash, personal check, official bank check, wire transfer, or electronic transfer. These are the same options that they can use for initial earnest money, with the if they need to use a method differently than just writing a check. Right here, let's pay attention to this. If they do offer, and as the buyer's offering, they want to do an electronic transfer right here. Let's say they want to send it by what, Venmo or Zelle, whatever electronic means. If they want to send it by that means, you've got to identify what that means is. Now let's look down here just a little bit and let me show you here. If the parties agree that the buyer can pay by that means, if the seller signs this agreement and doesn't contradict that Venmo, then the seller has to make sure that he provides the account or has an account to be able to transfer it that way. Does that make sense? Because there's some people who don't. In fact, I was working with a party a couple of weeks ago, and they said they didn't. They had. I think they had Venmo, and I had asked for Zelle or vice versa. I forgot which one. But also, you need to keep in mind the electronic transfers have maximum daily transfers. So if you're giving a $10,000 or your buyer's giving a $10,000 due diligence fee, there is only one way that you can do that. If you don't do it in a probably an official check, there would be only one way, and that would be wire transfer. How many sellers do you think are going to want to give their routing number and account numbers to have the money transferred into it? Well, we've had a number do it. So you've got to facilitate getting that due diligence fee into the hands of the seller by the effective date. Now, from what I'm understanding, and I see what's happening in the marketplace, it may be done within 24 hours, but it's probably not going to be done instantly. But remember, they have agreed contractually that it will be done on the effective date. So help your buyer to understand the necessity and the urgency of it. Also help them to understand that if they don't give it, they don't have the right to terminate the contract. So the due diligence fee is really critically important to the buyer. And obviously it's important to the seller because they get that money in their hands right then. Initial earnest money. Initial earnest money is always going to go to the attorney. We do not handle, and most firms now are not holding their own trust of accounts. Okay, so you need to start talking with the buyer pretty early on. Maybe during that time you talk a little bit about professional services. One of the things that you're going to talk to about is the attorney that's going to be the escrow agent and the one who's going to close the transaction. If they don't know one, you can certainly recommend ones that you hear the other agents have used, or maybe the one that you've used. And I would typically want to give them at least 2 or maybe 3 names that they can check out if they want to. Otherwise, find one that's convenient, because they're going to have to get the money to them. It's the buyer's responsibility to get it to them. The buyer can let you deliver it, but it's the buyer's responsibility to get the money to it. And look here, it has to be within 5 days of the effective date. There is not an option of how many days. It must go within 5 days of this contract, effective date of this contract. You are not going to see additional earnest money very often, but if you do, look here, it's time of the essence. So be mindful of that. So DDF is very, very important. Again, on this page, it gives you the definitions. Right here is where you're going to write the attorney's name. If you want to put the law firm's name here, it doesn't have to be a specific attorney's name. You may put the specific, but you do want to have at least the firm name, all right? Because that's where now all parties know where the earnest money is being held, and it must be deposited within 5 days to this law firm. You can point out here if there is a dispute. It can be obviously negotiated out, but if not, most likely it'll have to go to court. Now let's scoot on down here. The due diligence period, remember I told you that you have to have a specific date, that you have that 5 p.m. time frame. And here's that word, time being of the essence. So if you're going to give them 21 days, you're going to put 5 p.m. on. And if you want to write out the 21st day, you can do it that way. Most people prefer a date. Lenders particularly want to see a date on the closing date anyway. If I were going to give them 21 days, I'd probably put 22 or 23 days in there, because it often will take a couple of days to negotiate and get a contract. So you might want to take that in consideration. Now, this blank down here is basically your settlement date. That's the date that everybody goes to the attorney's office and signs away their life, but they don't get the keys to the house. So that's where you want to make sure that you have the date that's agreeable to all parties. This little paragraph is where we got those 4 things that are considered closing. You have to go through those 4 steps for it to be closed, and that just itemizes it out there right there. Okay. This is, you see anything that the light is blue, that's a note. It's to say, take a note of this. Anything that's a warning, obviously it's a really take note of this. This is where you are to help the buyers to understand that we are an attorney state. We are not a title state. We are an attorney state. Some people come from states where title companies close transactions. I was a realtor in Tampa, Florida for many, many years before I came up here. And we always used title companies and never called an attorney in unless it was something major. So when I came up here, it was kind of strange to start using an attorney. So you might want to make sure that the buyer understands that you need to choose an attorney, because we are an attorney state. Special assessments. You're going to see about 3 different places in this contract notes about special assessments, but by and large, special assessments are those assessments that are required to be paid. They're required to be paid by the seller at closing, but the buyer needs to know if there are some assessments that are not being paid by the seller. In other words, they're proposed, or they may be coming on as an assessment. The buyer has a right to know that, and that's what you'll find out by talking to the HOA. Fixtures. Oh my gracious mercy me, fixtures. We talked about this a lot last week, Evelyn, didn't we, about the fixtures? Buyers and sellers sometimes don't have any idea of what goes with a house and what's going to be there, and they have different understandings of what's going to stay in the house. So you have a list here of things that are anticipated being left of the house in the listing agreement. All of that is listed for the seller to agree or not, or to say that they don't stay. One of the main things that I want you to point at are 2 things. Storage sheds right here. When you're walking through the property and you see a storage shed, don't miss the opportunity to ask if the buyer would want the shed, because according to the contract, the shed stays with the property, and you would need to confirm with the seller that they haven't exempted that storage shed. Okay. In your MLS agreement, or the listing agreement, they can exempt something such as the storage shed. That is supposed to be in the MLS data sheet. So when you look in the MLS sheet, there's a little field called exemptions. If storage shed is listed there, then that means the seller has exempted that from the sale of the property, and he doesn't intend to leave it. That doesn't mean that you can't ask for it, but it means that they didn't intend to leave it. So it's a point of concern. Another thing is mirrors right here. Mirrors attached to walls, ceilings, cabinets, or doors. And look here, all bathroom wall mirrors. That means the powder room too. For years, we've had disputes on the powder room mirror because they were always so pretty, and of course the selling wife wanted to take them with her, and the buyer's wife wanted left. So make sure that they know the powder room bathrooms do stay and you might have to argue with the listing on that. I've had to do that too. Unpairing of data. This is to make sure that the buyer has privacy, you know, that the seller is required to unpair any way that they would have access to that house, even if it means putting it back to the manufacturer's settings initially. You might want to take a note of something here. Items that are leased or not owned. More times than one, that would have to do with the security system. All right, so make sure that you have a clear understanding of the seller has service on the security system. The security system these days are built into the house, but the service is not. So if the buyer wants to have the service, you can work that out with the service provider, but it must be worked out before closing so that the seller either pays for it at that time or the buyer gets it transferred to them. Items that do not convey, again, look for that word exemptions in the MLS and see so that they know that it doesn't convey. Now, let's look at this little right here, personal property. Personal property. Do you know a refrigerator is considered a personal property? A washer and dryer might be. But beyond that, lenders do not want to see they don't want to see grandma's antique bedroom set. They don't want to see patio furniture. They don't want to see the pool table. They will accept the refrigerator and the washer and the dryer as personal property, even though, look here, it says that it's transferred to the buyer at no value. They don't want to see it. So if you have if the seller wants to sell some furnishings, that should be done outside of this contract. You don't write it on this contract. It's like selling on Marketplace or Craigslist or whatever. The buyer and the seller just write out a piece of paper and itemize the things they're selling, agree upon a price, they sign it, and they agree that it'll be conveyed at closing of this property. If there is no refrigerator listed in the MLS and the buyers want the refrigerator, you write it on here. If there's a refrigerator listed in MLS and you don't write refrigerator on it, the buyer doesn't get it. So if the buyer wants that refrigerator, whether it's in MLS or not, make sure to write it right here. That is part of the agreed upon price. All right. Again, that's kind of what it says right here. The due diligence process, this explains it. We talked about it in the overview a while ago. This explains about, but make sure right here that where it says the seller is not obligated to grant extensions. If they can't get their due diligence done in the period of time that is as agreed upon in the contract, it may be, oh, well, and I've seen this happen. The seller is not under obligation to do any repairs to this house. It's been sold in its current condition. And unless the repairs are asked for, requested, and agreed upon prior to 5 p.m. on that end date, everything is over. If they go past 5 p.m., they're going to buy it as is. All right. So that 5 p.m. is critically important to get the repairs negotiated, and they're negotiated on a form called due diligence request. And on that form, you will write what the buyer wants. The seller is going to agree or not agree based upon the inspection report. And again, it's critically important that buyer and seller sign that document, that agreement, before 5 p.m. In fact, I would make sure it was signed before 3 p.m. If there's not a signature by either party, the buyer has the right before 5 p.m. to submit that termination form. And the form that they would present is form 350. It's termination by notice to the seller that the buyer is choosing to terminate the contract. If they get that in by 5 o'clock, terminate the contract, they will be entitled to get their earnest money back. They will not be entitled to get the due diligence fee back. But you want to help them to understand, in order to have their earnest money back, they've got to get the termination in before 5 p.m. But the better solution is to get an agreement as to the repairs before 5 p.m. Can you tell? I can't stress it enough. Okay. And look here, there is no loan contingency in this contract. There is not a contingency in this contract. If everything is geared on due diligence, and it's like a slide rule. You have to slide it up and down to make it work for the buyer and the seller. Even if there's a house to be sold in another area or in any area, if they have to sell a house, there is no contingency for selling a house. It has to be done during the due diligence period. So it's really important that you understand the depth of what due diligence period means in this contract. Right here is another list, just like phase 2 on that overview I showed you. This again is the list of things that the buyer is going to expect to be done during this period of time. Here's your special assessment, your streets. Make sure that it has public access. If they want a survey, and I don't know why in the world anybody would ever spend the money they spend on these properties and not have a survey, but again, they would have to have that. Insurance, make sure they don't wait to the last minute to get their homeowners insurance, because it's taken at least 2 weeks to get homeowners insurance these days, unless they have a real good relationship with the insurance agent. Okay. So the property investigation is outlined right here in the offer to purchase. You want to, again, underline this. You see it capitalized. This property is being sold in its current condition. The seller does not have to do one thing to make the house be able to close. Now, that doesn't mean they won't do something from time to time, but you want to make sure that the buyer understands that. Let's go on down here. This is closing constitutes acceptance of the property. If the buyer goes ahead and closes on the property, he's basically saying, yeah, I know there's some problems, but I've got to get in that house and I'm going to close on it. Then afterwards, sometimes they want to file a lawsuit on misrepresentation. That's their right too, but you can't stop closing because the buyer thinks that the seller knew a problem and he misrepresented. Misrepresentation has nothing to do with this contract. Misrepresentation is a legal term and it's done outside of this contract. So just keep that in mind. Because a lot of times they'll spout misrepresentation. I'm not going to close. Oh, yes, you are. Okay. Now, this little paragraph right here is if they're going to buy cash or pay cash for the house, you're going to check here. If they're going to get a loan, you're going to fill this information out strictly for information. This is not a contingency that the buyer has a right to get this, and if he doesn't get it, he doesn't have to close on the property. This is to give the seller confidence in agreeing to this particular offer. And in these days, agreeing to this offer over and above another offer, that this basically is saying to the seller, the buyer, and you might even, if a buyer is putting 20% down, they're going to get an 80% loan here. They're going conventional. Most listing agents are going to advise the seller that that's more desirable than an FHA with 3.5% down, which is what the seller has, the buyer would have in the loan. And an FHA appraiser often finds work that has to be fixed. And in that case, the seller would fix it. And if it doesn't appraise, an FHA appraisal, the buyer gets the earnest money back. They don't get the DDF back, but they get the earnest money back. So it's really important for, if the seller knows what type of loan or how much money the buyer is going to be putting into the house, if they need to choose between offers, that's one of the things they look at. Okay, so you are expected to put information in there, although it's not a contingency. Right here is the paragraph about if they have another house to sell. It is not always prudent to say they have another house to sell. It's ethically right to say to the seller, yes, I have to sell on that. I have to sell my other house before I can buy. It's not, I see it going both ways. The seller should have a right to select a contract thinking that there's not a house to be sold. And the buyer shouldn't be that deceptive. That's why I'm saying ethically, but there are also times that the buyer can pay for 2 mortgages. If the lender says you don't want to do it and you don't want to do it very long, but you can still afford this house, in that situation, the buyer would not have to sell the house in order to buy the one they're making this offer on. So you kind of have to talk through that with them also. Let's come down here. Residential Property and Owners Association disclosure. That's what you looked at. And there's your mineral oil and gas. If they did not have it available for your buyer when you wrote the offer, don't check the buyer got it. All right. Go ahead and check the buyer didn't get it. It wasn't the buyer's choice not to get it, but don't check they did if they didn't. When they do get it, there will be a date on it that they sign that will supersede the fact that on this date they didn't have it. So you don't have to go back and change the contract. These are the buyer's obligations. They kind of itemize the things the buyer's going to have to pay for. Then you have, these are the seller's representations. The seller has to disclose if they have lead-based paint, obviously, if they know it. How long have they owned it? Watch this right here. How long have they owned it? There's a lot of flipping going on in our area where a buyer buys a house for the very purpose of fixing it up, making it look pretty, and selling it. And that's flipping. And it's an investment. And some people have the capabilities of doing that work, but be very, very cautious on those flips because they might make it look so pretty that you don't realize that it's rotten to the core. It just looks so good. And your buyer just falls in love with it because it's just so updated and so nice. But underneath that house or some of the structural components, you just be really, really careful because you don't see that many being changed. And you want to find out if they're building permits, if a person who's selling the home within a few months of buying it, and they've done all this work, make sure there's permits pulled for the work. And you can find permits by going to the website of the county where the house is located. You want to make sure that it has had permits. You ask first, but if the listing agent doesn't know or doesn't tell you, then you want to make sure you want to look for it. You want to find out. There's also something FHA flip. You cannot make an offer on FHA flip for 4 months. An appraisal stays on an FHA for 4 months. So there are several things to be aware of, and you'll learn all these. I'm just highlighting right now. You'll learn these as you go from the lenders, because a lot of our lenders do give some good training classes in the Market Center. Make sure on the homeowners associations, often there are 2. There may not be just one. You think there'd just be one, but there are a lot of neighborhoods that actually have 2. So right here where you have the 2 names listed, make sure that you wouldn't know that unless it's on the property disclosure, but be aware to ask the listing agent on that. Fuel tanks, if there is a fuel tank on the property, the seller is required to disclose that. Again, it will be on the property disclosure and it should be in MLS. So the seller cannot sell the contents that's in that tank. The buyer has a right to do the final walkthrough, test the gas logs or test whatever needs to be tested on the fuel tank use. And when it closes, the buyer has a right to have the contents. They may be little, or they may be more, but the seller cannot sell the contents. For years we did that. This has just changed in July. So just be aware of that. The seller has an obligation to convey the property without any liens on it. Obviously, they've got to sell with a clear title. In this contract, there is no place for the seller to get out of the contract other than that initial day when they don't pay the due diligence or the earnest money, the seller can terminate. Or if they can't convey clear title, they have to terminate. And if they do terminate, they have to give back the due diligence fee, the earnest money, and reimburse the buyer for any expenses that they incurred. You don't see that very often, but occasionally, and it is in your contract. The access to the property, this buyer has a right to have access to the property to do all these inspections, right? So basically, it's written here in the contract where they have a right. And look at this right here, removal of seller's property. Do you know we actually have some people who don't think they're supposed to move out the day of closing or the day of settlement, so the buyer can do a walkthrough and move in? But I understand in some parts of the country, sellers can stay in a house, up to a month. Well, that's not North Carolina. All right, so the house should be ready to be occupied on the day that they actually close on it, or of the day of possession. Sometimes you have something called buyer possession. If it's going to be buyer possession, then that would be the day. Let's see, let's scooch on down here a little bit. Right here, the deed is to be made to. Some people put the word as directed by buyers. That means the buyer's going to tell the attorney. Don't just put as directed by buyer. Or you can go ahead and put the legal names of who the buyer is, whether it's an entity or whether it's individuals. In North Carolina, we have something called a marital right. So if the couple is married and you put both names on the deed, both of them own it 100%. Each one owns it 100%. So if one dies, the other party already owns it 100%. They don't have to go through probate to get the ownership. That's not the way it is in all states. That's the default in North Carolina. So if you put the husband's name on it because he's got or the wife's name, individual, if they're getting the mortgage, sometimes it'll just be one person's name. If they are married in the state of North Carolina, where the property is located, they each still own it 100%. So just be aware of that and talk to the attorney if they have any questions on that. This is where you're going to put any costs that the seller may pay for the buyer. We haven't seen that very much in the last 2 or 3 years, but over the years, you will often see a buyer needing to finance those closing costs. So what they do include the amount in the price. So you might have $4,000 in closing costs. So your price of the house is going to include those $4,000. And right here is where it's going to say the seller is going to pay $4,000 toward the buyer's closing. And look at the word expenses, not just the loan closing costs. It's expenses. And we're seeing one of the things this week I got a call on is like 2-1 buy downs. Do you know what I'm talking about when I say a 2-1 buy down? Sometimes a seller will pay X number of dollars to buy the interest rate down 2%. Then they'll pay another set of dollars to buy it down 1% so that the buyer can afford to buy that house. Through the years, we've had to do that. That would be something that would be an expense over and above what would be the normal loan closing costs. So most of the time, those loan closing costs cannot be more than 3% of the sales price. And FHA, excuse me, on a VA, it's 4%, but just kind of keep in your mind about 3%. But those 2-1 buy downs could add up to more. So we might be seeing an addendum come out from the state that would address that, but just kind of be aware of it. Right here is where it says the seller has to pay any special assessment. It basically puts it in the contract that they do have to. Again, if you're going to order a warranty, this is where you would note that you're ordering that. Now come on down here to the condition of the property. The property at closing has to be in substantially the same condition, except for wear and tear, of the time from the time the buyer made the offer to the time the buyer closes on the property. You've got to make sure that it's substantially the same condition. If there is a fire or something that would cause insurance to be involved, that is something they can negotiate out, and it basically allows the buyer to receive those funds if the buyer chooses to proceed with the contract. The delay in closing, remember we talked about the 7 days. This is the paragraph that explains about those 7 days. It's right here. Okay, so that's in paragraph form. The there's such a thing as buyer possession before closing. Every now and then, a seller will be very understanding of a buyer's need to get in a couple of days early for whatever reason, and there is a form called buyer possession before closing. There is a form called seller possession after closing. So if the seller cannot move of a closing, use that form to get agreement on how much they're going to pay for the right to stay in that house. Okay. There are a number of addendums. We're going to have a whole session one day on addendums, the addendums that you're going to use primarily with this offer to purchase, not all of them. Remember early on when we're talking about the mobile home, if there is a mobile home on it, you need to use this particular one. If there's a lease, maybe there's a tenant in the property and there's a lease, you're going to need to use this addendum. Additional signatures. If there's more than 2 people signing the listing or the buyer's agency agreement or the offer to purchase, you're going to have to use the additional signatures addendum to get additional signatures, obviously. And remember, in North Carolina, it's not only that it's like the heir, that's often when it happens in the States. If the heir is married, you have to get the spouse to sign too. Okay. So you'll use that additional signatures addendum more than you might think right now. Go down through here. These are basically, again, read through these things. They're not difficult to understand. Just be aware of them. This is something important, a computation of days. Always calendar days in North Carolina, not business days. Business days take into account Saturday and Sunday and holidays. Calendar days go right straight through all of them. So when you're putting anything to do with days, it's computed on a calendar day. Now, this paragraph here on remedies, this is what happens if somebody breaches and somebody doesn't do what they're supposed to do or didn't do what they agreed to do. This is legally what their rights are, and it spells it out for the buyer, for the seller, and who pays the legal fees. Okay, so that's basically the contract, and you're going to get the signatures here. Again, look here, you got a separate section for the entity buyer or the entity seller. Otherwise, they're going to sign up here. If they're an entity, they sign here. Make sure you go through the wire fraud warning again, because this is where the fraud most of the time is happening. It's when they're either wiring funds into the closing or back to the seller. So you want to make sure. Now that basically is the end of the contract. That's the end of the agreement between the parties. There are 2 additional pages. If you'll give me a couple more minutes, I want to show you that. This is what's called notice information. Now, when the buyer or the seller is conveying information to the other party, make sure that you have the listing. This is the listing side, and this is the buyer side. You say, well, I'm representing the buyer. How am I going to know this? Take it off the MLS sheet. All the information is right there. So you need to put this for the attorney's benefit, not so much yours, but have it here. This is your information. The selling firm is going to be obviously Keller Williams Ballantyne. And here's where you put your name. And if you're designated, you check here. If you're not designated, you fall under the buyer's agent or seller's sub-agent up here. Now, what I'm going to recommend, when it says buyer notice or seller notice, I'm going to recommend that under buyer's notice that you put contact agent. You do not want to give the other firm your buyer's information readily. You don't want to give it to them. They need to go through you to get to your buyer. And I would suggest the seller do the same thing. Don't put anything here. That's up to the other agent. And again, that's just for notices. Like I told you a while ago on the termination, that's termination by notice to the seller. Well, by notice would need to go to the listing agent, not directly to the seller. All right. So that's another use of the notice. Now, this is the final page that's produced with this form, but it's not part of the form. This is receipts. If you, for whatever reason, and sometimes you do, agents do take the DDF check and the agent gets it to the listing agent. The listing agent gets it to the seller. All right. That way, you know, it's done. So if you do take the check and you do give it to the listing agent, then right here, we're going to put the amount of money that the check is. This is the listing firm. This is a signature. It does not have to be the listing agent. Anybody at that firm can receive the check, but they must sign here and print their name. And this is when the seller actually gets the check or actually gets something brought to him. The seller would find out. You're mostly important right now. As long as you get it out of your hands and get it to the listing firm, it's not your worry that the seller got it. It's the listing agent's worry that they get the seller signature. But you need to know one of these signed that they got the DDF. Down the last part of that page, this has to do with the earnest money. The earnest money here would be the attorney, obviously, that holds the escrow. You might not have this form for the somebody at the attorney's office to sign when the buyer takes the money. So you can email them, and an email is sufficient as long as it's coming from the law firm. Then you can put that in as the receipt. When I say put it in, submit it in your opportunity. Now, if there were to be additional earnest money, it would be the same way. You would hope to get it from the attorney, but if not, you would want to have an email. And remember, that's a time is the essence date. So you would have to make sure of that. Well, speaking of time, I have gone over my time. You all have been very gracious to let me go over my time. I just wanted to finish the offer to purchase for sure. And if you have any questions, my telephone number is 704-904-6625. It's 704-904-6625. And my email is my full name, SABRAROMEO@kw.com. So be sure and give me a call or call Tasha. Tasha is in the office 3 days a week. She keeps office hours, so you're welcome to give her a call or check with her in person. So thank you for being with me today. And if you want a copy of the recording, let me know. I'll send it to you. Email me. Otherwise, I'm going to email these forms. And I hope I haven't crowded your brain too much this afternoon. And happy selling out there. Okay. Bye, y'all. Good to see you.
Thank you.
Nice to meet those of you I hadn't met before. Bye-bye now.